So when we are listening to people's stories, and they are so very different from one another, it's really important to understand that when people tell their stories, it might all be the same story, but from different vantage points. They might all be a different story about the same thing, with how the person interprets his or her world that makes it different. It's really important to know how someone interprets his or her world when you are working with people. There are 5 ways in which people interpret your world, certainly within appreciative inquiry. And these are called principles. The first one is referred to as constructionist. And these are stories that people tell on their perspective and their experience. So you might remember the argument a few years ago as to whether a dress was black and blue or white and gold. People really did see one or the other. Think about an argument you might have had with a partner. I told you about this. No, you didn't. But in your head, you did know. You know you told your partner. But in your partner's head, he or she knows you didn't. Both people are correct, and both people were correct, or lots of people were correct about seeing the black and blue dress or the white and gold one. I remember reading an article about someone who distinctly remembered her dad reading her nighttime stories from a particular book, but in adulthood, she discovered the book she remembered him reading from hadn't even been published at the time. This story tells the story of the Titanic. We've heard all the stories from the surviving passengers and their families, but what about the polar bear standing on the ice floe that was hit by the ship? He might have an entirely different story to tell, which is equally true. Simultaneity principle, it asks you to think about how you ask a question or the language that you use. This is an important principle to remember when you come to writing your questions. When I was forced to study physics for a year at secondary school, and yeah, I was forced. We were asked to write an essay on the importance of thermals. So I wrote about how they kept explorers warm in cold climates and the pilots of gliders who were high up in the cold atmosphere. And I failed spectacularly because what he'd wanted was an essay about hot air rising. Well, strictly speaking, I wasn't wrong. He'd asked for an essay about thermals, and I gave him an essay about thermals, but he couched his question badly. Similarly, someone who had an interview at an art college was asked to expound upon the virtues of Gainsborough. Hailing from Lincolnshire as he did, he waxed lyrical about a certain market town. But what they actually wanted was a discussion about the artist. The interviewee wasn't wrong. They asked about Gainsborough. He told them about Gainsborough. So think carefully about the words you use and how you ask your questions. The anticipatory principle is about how we interpret our world depending on our natural tendency towards being positive or negative, and the breadth of one's imagination, perhaps. It's an important thing to remember, particularly when talking about a church's future. This is when someone anticipates what might happen next. When 2 people lose their job, one might think, yay, now I can retrain and try something new. Whereas the other might think, oh crap, now what? I'll never get another job. If you anticipate a shitstorm, you'll get a shitstorm. The poetic principle is how we interpret the world around us depending on our environment, and everybody's interpretation again is quite different. So when we listen to the story of the Sleeping Beauty, maybe you as the hopeless romantic go, "Aww, oh how lovely, she's rescued by a handsome prince. Oh, wish I had a handsome prince." But I, on the other hand, bristle with indignation and think of the hashtag #MeToo. How very dare he, taking advantage of a sleeping woman, giving her a kiss she didn't ask for. And how dare he assume he's the answer to all her problems anyway? Mrs. Quasimodo looks at Quasimodo and thinks how beautiful he is. You might look at him and go, ew, how could you? So when you hear a story, try not to interpret it using your own experiences, but those of the storyteller. The final thing is what I call the Tigger versus Eeyore principle. AI practitioners call it the positive principle. But I think this is more of a conscious principle in that you choose consciously to be more like Tigger and less like Eeyore. When you see a bottle of gloopy medicine like Tigger did, choose instead to see a scrumming treat like Tigger did. When you see a field of thistles, unlike Eeyore, choose instead to see a field of favourite food. You need to be able to practice this principle when helping people envision their future. Help them to identify the scrummy treats and favourite food.